This channel is part of the History Hit network.
In the year 1066, King Harold of England was killed at the Battle of Hastings. With him fell the house of Godwin, and the line of Saxon kings came to an end. Within 2 months, on Christmas Day of that year, William the Bastard of Normandy was crowned in Westminster Abbey. Only then, having won his crown, did the new king unleash upon the land the crushing force of his ruthless ambition, and truly became the conqueror. Harold's defeat at the Battle of Hastings was a shock to the surviving Saxon leaders. But, because of the nature of English society at that time, it did not result in either immediate or effective resistance from them. At this time, 11th century England was, like most contemporary European countries, a feudal society. In the aftermath of their defeat, many local officials and nobles were eager to make personal bonds of peace with the conqueror, as they had with the Saxon king who had gone before him. Even Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, attempted to make an immediate pact with William. Stigand had been appointed by Harold while his predecessor, a Norman, still lived. His name had, as a result, been vilified by successive popes. It was partly because of him that the Norman invasion fleet had sailed with a special banner blessed by the pontiff. While the new king crossed the Thames at Wallingford, Stigand submitted to him, hoping to retain his office. He was disappointed. This easygoing attitude towards political life may also have been responsible for the behaviour of King Harold's northern allies, Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. For reasons still unknown, these nobles had been too slow to turn south in aid of their king at Hastings. After Harold's death, they were content, at least at first, to return to their earldoms, believing that the new king would rule in the same way as the old. For the most part, they had always enjoyed independence from the Wessex-based king, and saw no reason why things should change. Sharing this simple belief, based on centuries of tradition, most of the south of England gave itself up to William. Winchester, the capital of Wessex, submitted without a fight. And, when he had burnt and pillaged enough of the surrounding villages, the burghers of London dismissed Edgar Etheling's vain proclamation as king and sent word to William, inviting him to his own coronation at Westminster.
By the evening of October the 16th, 1066, the King of the English, Harold Godwinson, his brothers, other members of the royal family, and a large number of the elite of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy lay dead on the field of Hastings. But William's position was far from secure. He had troubles in Normandy. He had a restless country which he needed to rivet his rule on as quickly as possible. He took his army from Hastings into Kent, where he remained waiting for the submission of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. The Anglo-Saxon nobles, headed by Earls Edwin and Morcar and Archbishop Stigand of Canterbury, were in a dilemma. Their king had been defeated, their army crushed, and yet the only legitimate heir to the West Saxon throne was a boy, Edgar, only a few years old, completely unsuited to taking the realm of power at this difficult time. There was a split decision as to whether to push Edgar forward as king, but finally they realised that they must submit to William. To speed their decision, William decided to lay waste part of the home counties. In a great harrying march, he encircled London. Part of his troops set fire to Southwark. And finally, the leaders of the Anglo-Saxons came to William, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, at Berkhamsted. And, says the Chronicle, they bowed down to him, that they swore to be his loyal men, and in return, William swore to be a gracious liege lord to them. And this, I think, is the key point, that William stepping into the shoes of an Anglo-Saxon king. Anglo-Saxon government relied on a strong monarch that had a tradition of monarchy for hundreds of years. William claimed to be the legitimate kinsman and successor to Edward the Confessor. Norman propaganda was to make out that Harold was a usurper. And promising to be, if you like, the legitimate heir to Edward, William was trying to set himself up as king and to take on board both the loyalty of the Anglo-Saxons and the administrative machine that would help him rule. This was symbolised on Christmas Day 1066, when William was crowned by Archbishop Aldred of York. Stigand was present, and the Norman bishops as well. It symbolised a plea for both a status quo of continuity, and it proclaimed William's legitimacy.
History Hit is like Netflix, just for history fans. With exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history, just for you. With familiar faces such as Dan Jones and Dr. Eleanor Yanega, we've got hundreds of documentaries covering the greatest figures and events of medieval history. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
But William was not a man to plod in the footsteps of tradition. William, who was known to his contemporaries first as the Bastard, then as the Great, was the illegitimate son of Robert the Devil, Duke of Normandy. He was born in 1027, and, after the death of his father, while returning from a pilgrimage to Palestine, he became a child ruler in one of the most warlike and turbulent regions of Europe. In the face of intrigue and attempted assassinations, William grew up to become the greatest and most respected of Norman leaders. He was a giant of a man, of great strength and bravery. But he was also ruthless and easily moved to acts of great cruelty. When once, in a local French skirmish, his enemies had mocked his low birth, about which he was forever sensitive, he had his prisoners summarily mutilated in revenge. With their eyes torn out and their hands and feet cut off, they were flung among their quickly silenced friends. William was not a man to accept the slightest form of independence from his rule, or tolerate even a suspicion of treason. Even during his coronation as the King of England, William's men were pursuing alleged traitors outside the Abbey by setting fire to local houses. All, it was said, but William himself and the officiating clergy ran out to take part in the routing of what turned out to be imagined traitors.
During the coronation ceremony, the Norman troops stationed outside, hearing the people within acclaim William as king, mistook the shouting for a riot and set fire to Westminster. Following 1066, William's task was clear. He somehow had to rivet Norman control on a country that was in a state of political flux. He also had to watch his back in Normandy, and one of the first things he does in 1067 is to go on a triumphal progress back to the duchy, leaving key lieutenants in charge of castles such as Dover, Hastings, Pevensey. But he takes with him the leading Anglo-Saxon magnates virtually as political hostages. And we have an account from a Norman chronicler who says that in Rouen, the Normans marvelled to see these prisoners brought with their long hair, their wonderful clothes, fabulously adorned filigree work of their Saxon ornaments. This was a triumphal progress. But William couldn't remain in Normandy very long. He distributed gifts, made sure that his control of the duchy was secure against his French enemies, against the Count of Anjou, the King of France, Count of Flanders, and then quickly returned to re-establish his authority.
William was careful to argue and establish in the eyes of the Church that his was a lawful and true succession to the throne. But already the brutal reality of his tyrannical methods had become evident. Many English nobles had abandoned their opportunity to unite in opposition to the invader. Their expectations of keeping their lands, therefore, was high. Now they felt the slap of Norman justice. On the grounds that they had acknowledged King Harold as usurper king in William's rightful place, Saxon possessions were deemed forfeit. The estates of Saxon lords were confiscated by the crown. As realization dawned in the land that the relatively easy days of old might disappear forever, the Saxon population turned, too late, to thoughts of serious resistance. The Normans met their challenge head on. Although the Normans spoke French and lived in what we now call France, they were actually a breed apart. The name Normandy meant land of the Northmen, and the Normans were in fact direct descendants of the Vikings. They'd retained both the traditions of seafaring adventure and a fierce, warlike attitude to life. They brought this zealous quality to all they did. Above all, this included their religion. No longer worshippers of the Norse gods, the Normans were fanatical Christians. They were also at this time among the best soldiers, craftsmen, administrators and artists in Europe. Wherever they could, they developed the arts and crafts they practiced, and became both accomplished architects and expert horsemen. They also excelled in all forms of hunting, which was, apart from being great sport, one more way of refining their military skills and weaponry.
One of the key Norman weapons was their cavalry. At Hastings, it was a combination of archers and these mounted warriors that finally defeated the shield wall of Harold and the Anglo-Saxons at Senlac. The Norman cavalry were heavily equipped with hauberks of mail, with long kite-shaped shields, with lance and sword. They rode superbly bred and trained war horses. These horses, unafraid of the noise of battle, were fighters in their own right. We have a description of William's own horse trampling on people at Hastings. The knights would ride knee to knee in a charge, put in groups of 3 or 4, and they had great tactical flexibility. The key weapon of the knight was the lance, deployed in a shock tactic. The knight would couch his lance under his arm, bring his shield up for protection, feet in long stirrups, high-backed saddle, and together a group of Normans would charge with a great shock impetus whenever they struck a static line of infantry. One contemporary, speaking about the Franks on the First Crusade, said, "The charge of the Normans is irresistible. It could bore its way through the walls of Babylon." The Norman knight was the tank of the 11th and 12th century.
And as William sent out this weapon to crush rebellion wherever he saw, or even imagined it, he gave little warning and still less mercy. Another Norman development was that of the quickly erected military fort. From the moment William landed in England, he began to build these huge circular mounds of earth, using the forced labour of Saxon peasants. At the top of the mound, or motte, a timber fortress was constructed. In front of this was an outer court called a bailey, which was protected by the earthwork enclosure. Where possible, the mound was surrounded by a moat. Eventually, the timber fortress was replaced by stone, which later evolved into the distinctive Norman keep and castle design.
Castle's basic function was to protect a small group of horsemen, allowing them to sally out and suppress the local countryside. Remember that the Normans were always a very small minority, maybe about 10,000 in the initial years of the conquest at most, living amongst a hostile population. It was imperative that they had these fortified bases. What the Normans did, they would build a castle, often by requisitioned Saxon labour. There's a deep irony there that the Saxons are forced to build the very mechanisms of their own oppression. But from that, they used the castles as a springboard for further conquest. They would build a castle within, let's say, 15 miles of the next one, the operating radius of horsemen in a day's ride. And then from that castle, they would take a further area of territory, consolidate with the castle, and move on. By the death of William the Conqueror in 1087, England was literally studded with castles. Probably by the year 1100, there are over 1,000 motte and bailey castles in Britain.
Many examples of Norman castles stand to this day. Although some have been altered or rebuilt in the intervening 800 years in the traditions of later periods, their massive earthworks remain as an indication of how important a weapon they were in 11th century warfare. These robust, simple castle keeps, with their distinctively heavy pillars and round-headed doors and windows, are, in some ways, the most rudimentary of buildings. They were, after all, constructed out of expediency rather than ostentation. Clifford's Tower in York stands on an earth mound which was raised under the supervision of the Conqueror himself. Although only part of York Castle, the surviving tower even now retains its domination over the surrounding town. How much more psychologically imposing must such a building have been to the already defeated Saxons?
In military terms, the Saxons had no real answer to the castle. Several castles fell, for example York in 1069, but this was because they were vulnerable, because they're made of wood. But generally speaking, a handful of men could defend against several thousand people in a castle. This was even more true when castles became built of stone from the early years of the 12th century. Stone castle, very difficult to attack unless you have sophisticated siege weapons, and effectively the native Saxons did not have these weapons. Stone castles, however, were very few and far between. They were extremely expensive to build, and it's symbolic of William's power and prestige that one of the first castles built of stone in England is the Great Tower of London, the White Tower, which was his fortified palace, massive building that would have overawed London, and it would have shown his great prestige and power to the conquered people.
Middleham Castle was built in about 1170, and in later years would become a stronghold of Richard III. Pickering Castle, not far from the east coast, is a fine example of the Norman mound and moat. A shell keep still stands on the mound, along with a cross wall and a ditch which divides the castle into two courts. Part of the curtain wall also stands. Most romantic of all the remaining Norman castles must surely be Conisbrough Castle near Doncaster in South Yorkshire. This still beautiful and impressive site was the setting for many of the events in Sir Walter Scott's epic novel, Ivanhoe. Although it is believed to have been constructed within 100 years of the Norman invasion, the circular keep, with its 6 wedge-shaped buttresses, is almost completely intact. And the solid round towers on the curtain wall, which are among the earliest of their kind anywhere in England, still stand. The air of permanence which must have surrounded the Norman invasion was not a deception. That such castles survive to this day is testimony to the strength of their construction.
The motte and bailey's chief virtue was that it was cheap and easy to build. One could be thrown up in a matter of weeks simply by digging ditches, piling up the topsoil, and surrounding the top of the castle with a stout palisade of timber. I think we shouldn't underestimate how sophisticated these buildings of timber were. We have archaeological excavations and literary descriptions which describe certainly the keep on the mottes of some major castles as being very sophisticated pieces of carpentry, often with several floors, even with a kitchen in a wooden building, which is quite a feat of craftsmanship. However, they were vulnerable to fire, and as soon as Norman lords could afford to, they began to transform wooden castles into ones made out of stone. This was, however, a very gradual process. A stone-built castle was phenomenally expensive. Only the greatest lords could have a castle like Conisbrough. And well into the 12th century, many minor lords, perhaps the tenants of a lord like Hamelin of Warenne, would still have been living in a motte and bailey castle made of timber.
These mounded citadels were virtually impregnable. Once established, they completely dominated the countryside around them and provided a perfect base for Norman soldiery.
Conisbrough Castle has been here for over 800 years, and this is one of the finest examples of Norman architecture. It would have been probably whitewashed in its time to really recreate a symbol of power for the whole area. It is a circular keep supported by 6 massive buttresses. It's made of magnesium limestone, and it's ashlar, which means it's dressed stone, and it's self-cleansing. So that's why the outside looks practically as new today as it did 800 years ago when it was first built. On the other hand, inside the keep, it was never meant to be exposed to the elements, and this is the problem that we've had in the last 100 years. Because of the heavy industry of the area, the stones actually suffered from acid rain now and the obvious wind erosion, which unfortunately has damaged a lot of the carvings inside the keep, particularly in the chapel, which will obviously be gone forever. The reason why we've put the roof on now is to preserve what is left of the keep inside for future generations. And now we've actually added 2 floors, which not only does it preserve the monument, it adds now to the feeling that you're actually entering a real castle, and it recreates a total atmosphere of what it was like 800 years ago.
The building of such bases was always the first step in William's extended campaign to suppress and punish the people of England wherever he smelled rebellion.
In the Easter of this year, the king came to Winchester. In that year, 1068, Easter was on the 23rd of March. Soon the Lady Matilda came hither to this land, and Archbishop Eldred consecrated her queen in Westminster on Whit Sunday, 1068. When the king was informed that the people in the north had gathered together and would oppose him if he came, he marched to Nottingham and built a castle there, and so on to York, and there built 2 castles, and also in Lincoln, and in many other places in that part of the country. Earl Gospatrick and the best men went into Scotland.
William waged a campaign in the southwest for 2 years, establishing and fortifying his bases there. This was essential in order for him to introduce the Norman system of rule. There can be little doubt, however, that he was set on destroying the last remnants of the old Saxon house of Godwin, which had been concentrated on these areas. And the most efficient means at his disposal was the systematic pillage of the land. At a time when merely to be Saxon could be construed as treachery, many men died at the hands of the conqueror's lawgivers. Death was often a punishment to be desired compared with some treatment meted out to those who in any way crossed the king.
Some of them were blinded. Some of them were banished. Some were brought to shame. So all the traitors to the king were laid low.
By 1068, William had firmly established his rule over the south. In the north, however, although he was acknowledged king, very little change had yet taken place. In particular, Northumbria and Mercia, under the Earls Morcar and Edwin, remained as they had been under Harold. In 1068, perhaps as a deliberate test of the loyalty and tolerance of these northern Saxons, William made a proclamation concerning the earldom of Northumberland.
1068. In this year, King William gave Earl Robert the earldom of Northumberland. But the inhabitants opposed and slew him and 900 of his men. Prince Edgar came to York with all the Northumbrians, and the citizens came to terms with him. King William marched from the south with all his levies and ravaged the borough, slaying many hundreds, and the prince returned to Scotland.
Although the rebellion was suppressed and the 2 earls were pardoned, the status quo in the north had been irreversibly upset. A year later, as accusations of treachery flew across the still disunited kingdom, there was a second rebellion. This time it was made much more serious by the participation of the sons of the King of Denmark who invaded from east, and the incursion of the Welsh who crossed Offa's Dyke in the west to challenge the Normans. Also, King Malcolm III of Scotland chose to invade through Northumbria.
1069. In this year, Bishop Ethelric of Peterborough was accused and he was sent to Westminster, and his brother, Bishop Ethelwine, was outlawed. Then, between the two festivals of St. Mary and the Nativity, the sons of Sweyn and his brother came from the east, from Denmark, with 300 ships. Then Earl Waltheoc took the field, and the Prince Edgar and many hundreds of men came and joined those troops that were lying in the Humber, and set out for York. They landed and stormed the castle, slaying many hundreds. They carried off much treasure to their ships, and made prisoners of the leading citizens, and lay between the Ouse and the Trent the whole winter. King William marched into the Shire and completely devastated it.
So began William's great northern campaign, which was of a savagery and cruelty previously unknown even in the southern heartland of the defeated King Harold.
In 1069, William the Conqueror faced the greatest threat to his rule so far, a coalition of the King of Scots, the King of Denmark who sent a fleet which entered the Ouse estuary, a rising of the Northern Earls, outbreaks in Wales and the South Countries. William's response was short and brutal. His army entered Yorkshire, laying waste, killing and burning whatever he could find. Crops were garnered together and systematically burnt. Ploughs, instruments of agricultural production were destroyed in order to create an artificial famine. Those who escaped the Norman swords died of slow starvation. A chronicler records that the streets and houses lay empty, the fields littered with bodies, and there was no one left alive to bury them.
Between Durham and York, King William's men destroyed all property they encountered and killed every man they could catch. Not one house remained standing. Not one man, once discovered, escaped. Even 17 years later, hundreds of villages remained uninhabited ruins. The north and east ridings of Yorkshire were almost completely depopulated by the massacres. The people of Durham, receiving warning, fled northwards. But the homes, horses, and cattle they left behind were destroyed. In desperation, with nothing to return home to, many of these dispossessed people sold themselves into slavery abroad, and there was a vast infusion of refugees into Scotland. This was the harrying of the north. It was an act of inhumanity of biblical proportions, an atrocity almost unequalled. Yet the act was of its time, for the Normans were, above all, zealous Christians, carrying the blessings of the Pope with them on their genocidal rampage into the pagan north. This harrying was successful. There could, quite simply, be no more rebellions in the north after such a holocaust. As a direct result of this shattering campaign, the north ceased, from that day on, to be a separate domain. In the past, the north had been tied more firmly to the tributes and traditions of Scandinavia and the Danelaw than to the London-based King of Wessex. Now, it was firmly placed within the control of the English monarch. Within a generation, the Norman architecture of Durham Cathedral arose from the ruins of the pagan devastation. Symbolically, its construction was an example of the sheer force of Norman strength, will, and energy. In fact, the cathedral, attendant to Durham Castle, was built with slave labour, under the overseeing eyes of only a handful of Norman architects, soldiers, and churchmen. Such was the painful taming of the wild north. By the year 1070, the last stage of William's military conquest took place. The Isle of Ely in the Fens was a secluded, boggy area, As well as being notoriously difficult terrain, it was the home of a proud and taciturn people who were pure Saxon by descent. Here, the last Saxon rebellion took place. It was led by Hereward the Wake, a charismatic leader with a genius for guerrilla warfare and a good knowledge of the local waters.
In the Fens, resistance was being carried on by Hereward the Wake, aiding Earl Morcar, and they had risen up in expectation of aid from the Danish fleet. William, however, bought off the Danish fleet. He bribed them to go away, and this left Hereward and his followers isolated. William built logs across a causeway. He made a causeway across the marshy fens into the Isle of Ely, which was Hereward's headquarters, and finally subdued this guerrilla warfare. Hereward disappeared from history into legend.
If more men had fought like Hereward in the early days of the invasion, William's campaign may have been stopped in its tracks. But though Hereward and his people fought nobly, his resistance began far too long after the rest of England had been subjugated. William was, by now, able to mount a massive siege operation against Hereward's base in the Isle and maintain it without distraction. The operation is described in the medieval Lord Chronicles.
Bishop Ethelwine and Syward Barn and many hundreds of men entered Ely. When King William learnt of this, he ordered out naval and land levies and surrounded the district, building a causeway as he advanced deeper into the fens, while the naval forces remained to the seaward. Then the outlaws surrendered to him, namely Bishop Ethelrin and Earl Morcar and all their followers, except Hereward alone, and all who wished to follow him, and he courageously led their escape. The king seized ships, weapons, and many treasures, and dealt with the prisoners as he pleased. He sent Bishop Ethelwine to Abingdon. Very soon he passed away in the winter of this year.
It took a year to suppress the revolt of Hereward and take the Isle of Ely. But William won his inevitable victory, and with it, at last, held sway over all England. By now, William was so well established that he was able to deal with his Scottish neighbours in impressive style. In this year, King William led naval and land levies against Scotland and blockaded that country to seaward with his ships. He invaded the country with his land levies at the Forth, but gained no advantage from it. King Malcolm came and made his peace with King William, gave hostages, and became his vassal. And the king returned home with all his levies. The administrative structure of England from this time on had already been decided in part by the gradual manner of William's conquest. If the country had been taken over all at once, William would inevitably have parcelled out the lands to his followers in complete segments consisting of whole shires. But because Saxon lands had been confiscated one piece at a time, that was how they'd been conferred on the French-speaking barons and churchmen. As a result, one man's lands might be scattered in small lots in all parts of the country. This allowed a nobleman to derive an income, but made him reliant upon the king to govern and tax it. This centralization of power made the king much stronger. It also made it much easier for him to take the lands away again. This system of government consequently required a network of local governors to keep order. Through these officers, called sheriffs, William gained control over both Saxon and Norman malcontents alike. Another change made to help in the governing of the country was deliberate further divisions of the land. The boundaries of the 6 great earldoms were dismissed and carved into smaller units. The first to disappear was Wessex, which was identified far too closely with the fallen house of Godwin to ever survive intact. The result of these changes was the introduction of 42 counties, from Durham in the north to Bodmin in the southwest. These counties are still mostly recognisable in the structure of modern-day Britain. The power of William's court began to grow steadily. This core of central Norman power consisted of a permanent staff of officials and clerks who worked with an ever-changing flow of bishops and barons, which consisted of whoever was currently in the king's favour. The court assisted the king in any matter he laid before it, and gave advice on such things as policy and audit accounts. It even sat to try legal cases involving the barons. Although William travelled the country continually, settling disputes himself wherever possible, he introduced from the Norman system the tradition of sending a delegation from his court to represent him. This court delegation often employed the method of trial by inquest. This was a totally new concept in England, where trial by combat had long been the preferred method of settling disputes. But its introduction led to both peaceful settlements and protection of the king's rights, wealth and respect, and those of his vassals. Faced with the confusion of so many redistributed lands, the king needed information. He needed to know exactly who owned what lands and precisely how much they owed him. He also needed an overview of the entire state of England as it actually was. It has been suggested that such a detailed survey could have been made only through the force of William's grip on power and determined reorganisation of the land. Certainly no other European country of the time could have been so rigorously examined. A uniform set of questions was put to every district of the country. It was surveyed so carefully, wrote a Saxon chronicler, that there was not a hide of land in England of which he did not know who held it and how much it was worth.
In 1086, at the Christmas court at Gloucester, William took a deep speech, says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, with his councillors, and ordered an investigation into all the lands and holdings of his Norman subjects. Commissioners were sent round the country, and the greatest piece of medieval surveying ever undertaken was completed within a year, the Great Domesday Book. This recorded who held what land, which lord he held it of, what the value was in 1066, in the reign of Edward the Confessor, and now in the year 1086. Nothing, says the Anglo-Saxon chronicler, was left out. He surveyed everything down to the last pig and sheep. The Domesday Book allowed William to see the wealth of his newly conquered country. It also acted as a register of land tenure, so he knew immediately which baron held what land and who was enfiefed of that great baron. It also must be said that Domesday Book was a reflection of the sophistication of the Anglo-Saxon system that William had inherited. It was essentially an Anglo-Saxon administrative device that had allowed William to make the greatest survey of medieval Europe.
The depth of the survey, which made up the Domesday Book, is indicated by the note which the monks of Ely attached to their own Domesday returns. Bearing in mind the recent history of that place, it is difficult to believe that there was not at least a little irony in the writer's tone. Here it is written down, the inquest of the lands of Ely, as the king's barons inquire about them, namely by the oaths of the sheriff of the shire, and of all the barons and their French soldiers, and of the whole 100 court, and of the priest, the reeve and 6 villains of each vill, how the manor is called, who held it in the time of King Edward the Confessor, and who holds it now, how many hides, how many ploughs on the domain, how many men, how many villains, how many serfs, how much woods, how much meadow, how much pasture, how many mills, how much it was worth altogether, and how much now. All this 3 times over, once for the time of King Edward, once for the time when King William gave it out, and once as it now is, and whether more can be had from it than is now being given. The findings of the Domesday Book enabled William to ensure that all the old Saxon villages and townships which survived his conquest were incorporated into manors, which could, in turn, be directly taxed through its lord. This meshing of the old Saxon ways and the new centralising Norman court made England increasingly more stable. It was said that, at the very least, King William kept such good order in the land that a man of any substance could travel unmolested throughout the country with his bosom full of gold. Such claims have always been made on behalf of tyrants. But the Saxon commentator who made this observation was well aware that only a Norman could be of such substance as to muster a bosom full of gold. This tempers the boast with a hint of what reality lay behind the king's triumph. King William had brought peace and order to England. He had truly united it for the first time. Yet the country suffered now more than ever before from the stark division of its people into two separate classes. Under the old Saxon way of life, there were warriors and there were traders. Kings were as often elected as succeeded by birthright. In that chaotic, feudal society, small peasant communities were almost independent and largely unaffected as rulers came and went. The Normans, however, were from the outset a French-speaking nobility, an entire upper class which treated the Saxon population with utter contempt. A generation after the invasion, what gains were to be had from the new prosperity of English order were enjoyed exclusively by this haughty and warlike ruling class. Though impressive castles and beautiful cathedrals continued to be built, and the Norman architects expressed in stone the rigorous reorganization of their new land, the common people suffered.
The main impact of the Norman conquest was to replace a native Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with a small, dominant, alien aristocracy from France. This was extremely important because it meant that the rulers of England, who dominated government, who developed laws, were French-speaking. The culture of the aristocracy became French. Old English, it's Anglo-Saxon, was relegated to the level simply of language used by the peasantry. And it wasn't till Chaucer that English came back to court as a language of literature. Most Saxon peasantry, after the initial shockwaves of the invasion in the 1060s, probably would not have noticed a great deal of difference with the conquest. One lord was substituted for another, slightly more foreign, but the reeves, the bailiffs on the farms, the estates would have remained fairly similar. Taxes perhaps rose, but probably they would have done under Harold or his Anglo-Saxon successors. Similarly, there's a great deal of continuity in terms of towns. The Normans simply find a very healthy, flourishing urban economy. All they do is to plant castles in strategic places within those towns, but urban life continues very much as it was before 1066. Perhaps the most crucial of all changes, however, was that Anglo-Saxon England, which had been part of a Scandinavian empire, very much northern-looking, was drawn away from the north into the world of France. England became an appendage of the Duchy of Normandy, and after 1154 it became but part of the great Angevin Empire of Henry II.
The Saxon chronicles describe the suffering of ordinary people in the 21st year of King William's reign. Alas, how wretched and how unhappy the times were then. So fever-stricken lay the unhappy people in those days that they were never far from death's door until the pangs of hunger finished them off. Who can fail to be moved to compassion by such days as these? Or who is so hard-hearted that he cannot bewail such misfortune? But such things come to pass because of a nation's sins, because its people will not love God and righteousness. The king and leading men were fond, yea, too fond of avarice. They coveted gold and silver, and did not care how sinfully it was obtained, as long as it came to them. The king granted his land on the hardest terms and at the highest price. If another buyer came and offered more than the first had given, the king would let it go to the man who offered him more. If a third came and offered still more, the king would make it over to the man who offered him most of all. He did not care how very wrongfully the reeves got possession of it from wretched men, or how many illegal acts they did. But the louder the talk of law and justice, the greater the injustices committed. Unjust tolls were levied, and many other unlawful acts were committed, which are distressing to relate. In the summer of 1086, King William sailed to France. His relations with his French neighbours had deteriorated, and parts of Normandy had been plundered by the French king's men, based in Nantes. On the 9th of September 1087, having ridden upon Nantes and burned it, his horse stumbled, and he was thrown heavily against the iron pommel of his saddle. Now 60 years of age, his powers of recovery failed him, and he died. Of his death, the Saxon Chronicle says very little, and that is expressed in terms of acceptance, if some surprise that this monstrously rugged man could die. What can I say, the chronicler asks us, that bitter death that spares neither high nor low seized him? Alas, how transitory is the prosperity of this world. And yet William the Bastard, who became the Great, and is now known to us as the Conqueror, was a tyrant, a man of almost inhuman ruthlessness. By comparison, his son William Rufus, who immediately succeeded him on the throne, was a sympathetic man with very human traits. Yet, by comparison, the hapless Rufus, whose reign was one at best described as of continuity, was vilified upon his death within the pages of those same chronicles.
In the year 1100, King William held his court at Christmas in Gloucester, and at Easter in Winchester, and at Whitsun in Westminster. On Whit Sunday of this year, at a village in Berkshire, blood was seen bubbling forth from the ground, as many reported, and thereafter, on the morning after Lammas, King William was killed with an arrow while hunting by one of his own men. He was afterwards brought to Winchester and buried in the diocese in the 13th year of his reign. He was very harsh and fierce in all his rule over his realm, and very terrifying, influenced by the advice of evil counsellors who were always agreeable to him. By his own greed, he was continually exasperating this nation with depredation and unjust taxes. In his days, therefore, righteousness declined, and evil of every kind towards God and man put up his head. He oppressed the church of God, and in his days, if a head of a bishopric or an abbacy died, he either sold them for money or kept them within his grasp and let them for rent. For he claimed to be the heir of every man, cleric or lay. Therefore, he was hated by almost all the people and abhorrent to God.
The chronicles continue in the same fashion for some time. It is almost as though, having feared to speak in this way of such a force as William I, for fear of what he might have become in death, the Saxon chroniclers saved their bile to heap upon the head of his comparatively ineffectual son. And yet, if we look back only a year to the days when William still lived, and England was yet trembling in his grasp, we find in the Chronicles a verse, written in the last year of William's reign. It serves as his epitaph. He caused castles to be built which were a sore burden to the poor. A hard man was the king, and took from his subjects many marks in gold, and many more of pounds in silver. There sums he took by weight from his people, most unjustly and for little need. He was sunk in greed, and utterly given up to avarice. He set apart a vast deer preserve and imposed laws concerning it. Whoever slew a hart or hind was to be blinded. He forbade the killing of boars, even as the killing of harts, for he loved the stags as dearly as though he had been their father. Hares also he decreed should go unmolested. The rich complained, and the poor lamented. But he was too relentless to care, though all might hate him. And they were compelled, if they wanted to keep their lives and their lands and their goods and the favour of the king, to submit themselves wholly to his will. Alas, that any man should bear himself so proudly and deem himself exalted above all other men. May Almighty God show mercy to his soul and pardon him his sins.